Hey everyone, this is Revenge Rage. Let me tell you tonight's story. My father stood in front of 200 wedding guests and introduced me as his first wife's daughter. Not his daughter, his first wife's daughter. The distinction was so deliberate, so carefully worded, that a few people near me actually turned to look at my face to see if I'd caught it. I had. My stepmother smiled at me from across the room like she'd just watched something satisfying happen. My half-brother, 8 years old at the time, didn't even look up from his plate. And my father moved on to the next toast like he hadn't just quietly erased 17 years of my existence in one sentence. I was 22. I flew home from college on my own money for that wedding. I bought a dress I couldn't afford. I sat in the front row. 22 years later, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't saved, but still recognized the way you recognize a scar. My father was calling from a hospital in Phoenix. He'd listed me as his emergency contact without asking, and the nurse on the line said the words that made my stomach go completely still. "He's asking for you specifically. He says you're the only one who will come." Before I tell you what I said to that nurse, I want to ask you something first. What time is it where you are? And have you ever had someone make you feel invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to love you? Drop it in the comments. I want to know how far this reaches. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I work as a technical writer in Austin, and the apartment I live in has a deadbolt I chose myself, shelves full of books I picked without anyone's approval, and a cat named after a woman in a novel who survived everything thrown at her. People who know me now say I seem settled, grounded, like someone who has always known exactly who she is. They don't know about the wedding. My parents divorced when I was 4. My mother raised me mostly alone in a small house outside Cincinnati, working doubles at a radiology clinic and still finding time to quiz me on spelling words at the kitchen table. My father moved to Arizona, called on birthdays if he remembered, and sent child support checks that arrived late often enough that my mother stopped depending on them. He wasn't absent in the dramatic movie way. He was present in the worst possible way, just enough to make absence hurt more. When I was in middle school, he met Diane. She was fine, in the way that something can be perfectly pleasant and still feel like a closed door. She had her own kids from a previous marriage, a son named Marcus and a daughter named Britt. Then she and my father had my half-brother, Tyler, when I was 14. By the time I graduated high school, my father had a whole life in Phoenix that I visited twice a year and was never quite allowed inside. The visits had a texture I could never fully explain to anyone. There was always food, always a clean guest room, always my father saying he was glad I came. But there were also Sunday dinners where Diane talked about her children's soccer games for 45 minutes and my father never once mentioned my debate tournament that I'd just won. There were family photos on the wall where I appeared only in one, standing slightly apart from the group, the only one not wearing the matching shirts they'd ordered. There were conversations that stopped when I walked in, not because anything secret was being said, but because, including me in the natural rhythm of their house, felt like an afterthought that kept being forgotten. I told myself it was the distance. I told myself blended families were complicated. I told myself my father loved me in the way some people love things they don't know how to hold. Then came the wedding. Diane had been pushing for them to renew their vows for years. My father finally agreed for their 20th anniversary. It was a full event, venue rented, caterer booked, a photographer who cost more than my semester tuition. My father called me himself and said he wanted me there. That sentence, "he wanted me there," was the one I held onto during the 5-hour flight. The ceremony was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful. Diane glowed. Tyler, now 8, carried a small pillow with the rings on it and beamed like the sun. Marcus gave a toast that made people cry. Britt read a poem. I sat in the front row with my hands folded in my lap. My father's turn came. He held a paper, his reading glasses low on his nose. He thanked Diane's children by name. He thanked Tyler. He said he was a better man because of this family. He said family was everything. Then he looked at me and said, "And I want to acknowledge Claire, my first wife's daughter, for making the trip out." He said it gently. He said it like it was a kindness. In the brief silence that followed, I heard Diane's sister lean toward her husband and whisper, "Oh, I forgot he had a kid from before." I didn't cry. I had learned very early in my relationship with my father that crying in front of him produced a particular expression on his face, something between discomfort and mild annoyance, as if visible emotion was a burden he hadn't agreed to carry. So, I held still. I kept my face arranged in something that looked like a polite smile, and I watched the rest of the evening like I was watching it through glass. The photographer was the one who changed things. She found me near the end of the night, standing by the dessert table, because I didn't know what else to do with myself. She was a woman in her 40s, with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of calm that comes from spending years watching people at their most heightened and most real. She handed me a small plate with a piece of wedding cake and said, without any preamble, "I've been doing events for 16 years. I can always tell who's actually part of the family and who's been made to feel like they're not." I stared at her. She kept her voice even. She said, "The way he introduced you was a choice. You know that, right? It wasn't an accident or a slip. Words like that are prepared." I said, "I know." She said, "Good. Because the way you carry yourself tonight, nobody in this room is going to feel sorry for you. And that's exactly right. Don't let him have your grief as a performance. Keep it. It's yours." Then, she walked away to photograph the cake cutting. I stood there with wedding cake I didn't eat, and for the first time in my 22 years of being my father's daughter, I felt something shift. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more permanent. The understanding that what had just happened was not something I'd imagined or exaggerated. It had been witnessed. It had been named. And named things have a different weight than unnamed ones. I flew back to Cincinnati the next morning. My father texted me a week later saying it was good to see me. I replied, "Okay." That was the last real conversation we had for almost 3 years. What I didn't know at the time was that the wedding wasn't the end of anything. It was a document. A moment with a photographer, with witnesses, with a room full of people who heard exactly how my father chose to introduce me. And documents have a way of waiting. I finished college. I moved to Austin. I threw myself into work and rent and figuring out who I was outside of the annual performance of being someone's first wife's daughter on a visit. I found a therapist named Renata who had a philodendron in her office that had clearly been alive longer than most of her clients, and who listened to me describe my father with the same steady attention she gave everything. She said, once, after I'd described the wedding toast for the 3rd session in a row, "What do you want to do with this?" I said, "I don't know. Stop thinking about it, maybe." She said, "You keep coming back to it because it's unresolved. Not emotionally. Factually. He said something false in front of 200 people. You've been carrying the correction alone." That session was the first time I considered writing about it. I started with journaling, the way everyone starts. Then the journaling became an essay I shared in a small writing workshop I attended on Wednesday nights above a bookstore on South Congress. The other writers were careful with it. They pointed out the lines that hit hardest. They told me when I was being too gentle with my own story, and when I was being too angry. They helped me find the version of the telling that was cleanest and truest. One of the women in the workshop hosted a small podcast about family estrangement. She asked if she wanted me to read a portion of the essay on air. I said yes, mostly because I figured 12 people listened to it, and none of them were from Phoenix. The episode went up on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the podcast host texted me saying it had been shared more than anything she'd posted in 2 years. By the following Monday, I had 47 messages in my inbox from strangers. A woman in Michigan, a man in his 60s from Georgia, a college student in Portland who said she'd listened to it 3 times in a row. They all said versions of the same thing. I thought I was the only one who knew what that particular kind of invisible felt like. I want to pause here and tell you something about revenge, because people have very specific ideas about what it looks like. They imagine confrontations, speeches, moments where the wronged person stands across from the person who hurt them and delivers a verdict that lands like a hammer. What actually happened was quieter and more complete than that. My father found the podcast 8 months after it aired. I know the exact timeline because that was when his texting pattern changed. For years, he'd sent me the same categories of message. Holiday greetings, the occasional article about something he thought I'd find interesting, and birthday texts that arrived between 4 and 12 hours late, depending on what else he had going on. After the podcast, The messages became more frequent and more careful. He started asking how I was doing in a way that required an answer. He sent a long text one Sunday that started with, "I've been thinking." I read it twice and didn't reply. 3 months after that, Diane called me. This was unusual. Diane and I had exchanged maybe 30 words directly over the course of my entire adult life. She said she wanted to reach out because she felt like there was some misunderstanding about the vow renewal and she wanted to clear the air. I asked her what specifically she wanted to clarify. She said she felt the ceremony had been a celebration of their family and she hoped I hadn't taken anything personally. I asked her if she remembered the exact wording my father used to introduce me. She said she didn't remember the exact wording. I told her I did. She said, "Well, language is tricky sometimes." I said yes. It really is. Then I told her I needed to go and ended the call. My half-brother Marcus, who was by then in his late 20s and who I had genuinely liked as a kid despite everything, sent me a message saying he'd heard the podcast and that he thought I was brave for sharing it. I thanked him. He asked if we could talk sometime. I said maybe eventually. That was honest. The messages from my father kept coming. More layered now. More searching. He told me he'd been talking to a pastor. He told me he knew some things could have been done differently. He told me Tyler had heard the podcast too and hadn't taken it well and that he hoped I understood how hard things were for everyone. That last part stuck in my ribs for a day or two. The way the sentence curved from his accountability directly into my responsibility for Tyler's feelings. The way the apology had so many passengers. I was getting better at recognizing the shape of certain kinds of sentences. Then, 18 months after the podcast aired, I got the call. I was at my desk on a Tuesday afternoon editing a user manual for a software company when my phone screen lit up with a Phoenix area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me pick up. The nurse explained that my father had been admitted 2 days prior with a cardiac event. He was stable but needed to make decisions about his care and had listed me as his emergency contact for reasons she couldn't fully explain. He was asking for me. I said, "Is his wife not available?" The nurse paused. She said she'd been informed there had been some family difficulty and that he was very specifically requesting me. I sat with that for a moment. The irony of it was almost architectural. The man who had, for the better part of my life, allowed me to be adjacent to his family rather than inside it was now, in the moment where the stakes were real, asking for me specifically. Not his wife, not Diane's children who he'd raised, not Tyler, who he'd introduced by name at a wedding while I was called someone else's daughter. Me. I told the nurse I would call back within the hour. I went and stood at my kitchen window for a while, looking at the parking lot below my apartment. My cat came and sat on the counter beside me, with the serene indifference cats have toward human crises. I thought about the photographer at the wedding. I thought about the word choice, documents, named things. I called Renata. She picked up between sessions. I told her what happened. She said, "What are you feeling right now?" I said, "I feel like he's asking me to be his daughter now because it's convenient. The same way he asked me to be just a guest when it was convenient." She said, "And what do you want to do with that?" I said, "I think I want to go. But I want to go as who I actually am, not as who he needs me to be right now." She said, "Then go, knowing that." I booked a same-day flight. The hospital was clean and beige in the way hospitals always are, built for function rather than comfort. A nurse walked me to his room and told me he'd been asking about my flight every hour. That detail sat strangely. The man who'd sent birthday texts 12 hours late had been asking about my flight every hour. He looked smaller than I remembered. That happens with parents sometimes. You carry a version of them in your memory that is built from childhood scale, and then you see them grown down and ordinary, and it requires a recalibration. His hair was entirely gray now. There were machines. He had an IV in his left hand. When I walked in, his face did something complicated. Relief and guilt tend to produce that particular expression, that mixture of needing someone and knowing you haven't earned the right to need them. "Claire," he said. I sat down in the chair next to his bed. Not close enough to take his hand, but close enough that we could talk. He said he was glad I came. He said he wasn't sure I would. He said there was a lot he'd wanted to say for a long time. I said, "Okay." He started with the predictable things. He said he knew he hadn't always been present. He said the distance had been hard. He said he loved me and had always loved me even when he hadn't shown it well. These were the true things people say when they are frightened and need to believe they are still salvageable. I didn't interrupt them. Then he said, "About the podcast." I waited. He said, "What you described, the way it felt. I didn't know you felt that way." I said, "You introduced me as your first wife's daughter in front of 200 people at your wedding anniversary. I flew across the country for that event." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Diane had been working very hard to make her kids feel secure. There was a lot of pressure." I heard it immediately. The same architectural shape as the text message about Tyler, the apology with passengers. I said, "I understand there was pressure, but I'm asking you about the specific choice you made. You didn't say my daughter who lives far away. You didn't say my daughter from my first marriage. You said my first wife's daughter. You made me belong to someone else." He opened his mouth and closed it. I kept going. Not because I was angry. I was past the kind of anger that needs to be loud, but because I had promised myself on the plane that I would not leave this room having softened the thing that needed to be said clearly. I said, "I spent a lot of years trying to figure out what I was doing wrong that kept me on the outside of your family. I got better grades. I visited more than I was asked to. I was pleasant to Diane when she wasn't pleasant to me. I never asked you to choose between your families because I knew I would lose. And then I told the truth about one night, and you suddenly want to have a conversation you've had 15 years to start." His eyes were wet. He said, "I know." He said, "I know I failed you." He said, "I need you to know that Tyler," his voice caught. "Tyler listened to that podcast and he came to me and asked me why he'd never heard about how you grew up. He asked me why you were never in the family photos the same way." He said, "My son looked at me and said, 'Dad, why did you do that to her?'" I sat with that for a moment. Tyler was 23 now. He'd been 8 at the wedding with the ring pillow and the beaming smile. I said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him I was afraid of losing what I had, and I handled that fear badly. I told him I had let someone else's comfort come before my own child's dignity. And then I said I was sorry to him, because he deserved to know who his father actually was." That was the first honest sentence he'd said that didn't have passengers. I was quiet for a long time. The machines beeped in the rhythm that machines beep when someone is alive and being monitored. Then I said, "I'm not here because I forgive you. I'm here because I'm not the kind of person who ignores a medical emergency, even for someone who hurt me. Those are two separate things, and I need you to understand that they are separate." He nodded. I said, "I will help you navigate the next few days here. I will talk to your doctors. I will make sure the right people are contacted. But when you're discharged, I'm going back to Austin. And the relationship we have going forward, if we have one, is going to be built on what's actually true, not on what's comfortable for everyone else in your house." He said, "I understand." I said, "I need you to understand one more thing. I didn't make that podcast to punish you. I made it because I spent 22 years thinking the way I was treated was somehow a reflection of my worth. And it wasn't. It was a reflection of choices you made. There's a difference. I needed other people to hear that difference because I wasn't the only one living inside it." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "The photographer." I looked at him. He said, "At the vow renewal. There was a photographer. I always felt like she was looking at me a certain way that night, like she'd seen something." I said, "She had." He said, "What did she say to you?" I said, "She told me that the way you introduced me was a choice. That it was prepared. That I should keep my grief because it was mine." He closed his eyes. He said, "She was right." I stayed 3 days. I talked to his cardiologist. I helped fill out forms. I made sure his prescriptions were organized and that someone from his actual daily life, meaning Diane, who returned from visiting her sister on day 2, was fully briefed on his follow-up care. Diane and I were civil in the way two people can be civil when they have decided, without discussing it, that the time for pretending has passed. On the morning I left, my father walked me to the hospital entrance in a wheelchair because the nurse insisted. He looked at me for a long moment before I called the car. He said, I hope you know that what I said at that wedding, it wasn't because I didn't love you. I said, I know. That's actually the hardest part. It wasn't spite. It was just that my comfort ranked below someone else's. And you made that choice without thinking twice about it. Love isn't always the question. Prioritization is. He said, I want to do better. I said, I hope you do. For Tyler's sake, as much as anyone's. He asked you a real question. He deserves a real father. The car arrived. I got in. I watched the hospital entrance get smaller through the window, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not relief exactly. Not victory. Something more like completion. The kind you get when a sentence that has been grammatically broken for years finally finds its period. He didn't disappear after that. He called twice in the following month. Careful calls, shorter than they used to be, with less performance in them. He didn't start with how are things or it's been a while. He started with I've been thinking about what you said. That was different enough that I let the calls last a little longer than I would have otherwise. Diane sent me a card, paper, handwritten, which I found both startling and oddly moving. It didn't say much. It said she knew she hadn't made things easy, and that she was trying to understand her role in that. It didn't say she was sorry in exactly those words. But it was the first communication from her that wasn't asking me to agree with a version of events I hadn't lived. I didn't frame the card. But I didn't throw it away either. Tyler called me one Thursday evening out of nowhere. He had my number from our father, apparently. He said he'd listened to the podcast 4 times and that the second time he'd stopped it halfway through to go talk to his dad. He said, I feel like I grew up not knowing you were my actual sister. Like you were always this person who visited, and I didn't know that was weird until I was old enough to see it. I said, you were a kid. It wasn't yours to see, he said, still. We talked for an hour and a half. He told me about his job and his roommates and the fact that he'd adopted a dog he'd named something ridiculous after a character from a video game. I told him about Austin and the manuscript I was working on and the cat on my counter. He laughed at something I said, and his laugh sounded a little like my father's, which was a strange and bearable thing to notice. At the end of the call he said, Do you think you'll ever come visit? I said, maybe. Give me some time. He said, okay. And then, I'm glad you made that podcast. I said, me too. Here's what I want to say directly to anyone listening who knows what it is to be the person in the room who is introduced with an asterisk. The one who is present but not quite counted. The one who adjusts and accommodates and flies home on their own money, and sits in the front row and still manages to be slightly outside the frame. The instinct is to make yourself smaller so that nobody has to acknowledge the awkwardness of your presence. The instinct is to decide that keeping the peace is more valuable than being seen accurately. It isn't. Not because you should blow up every gathering or send scorched earth emails or demand apologies that nobody is ready to give. But because the truth of what happened to you, told clearly and without cruelty, in whatever form fits your life, is one of the most powerful things you own. My father spent over 2 decades constructing a version of our family that quietly edited me. 1 honest hour of audio undid 20 years of that construction without me raising my voice once. I didn't go to Phoenix to punish him. I went because I am the kind of person who shows up even when showing up is hard, which is something I learned from my mother, not from him. But I showed up as myself, not as the grateful visitor, not as the first wife's daughter, not as the sensitive one who takes things too personally, as his daughter. The one who kept records and kept her grief and kept going anyway. There's a specific thing that happens when someone who diminished you finally has to sit across from who you actually became. They often don't have language for it. They expected the version of you that needed them. They find a version of you that has long since built a life out of the wreckage of their choices. My father asked me, before I left the hospital, if I would ever fully forgive him. I said, I don't know yet. Forgiveness is something I decide, not something you wait for. And right now, I'm still deciding what our relationship gets to look like going forward. That's not punishment. That's just how trust works when it's been broken carefully and deliberately over a long period of time. He said, that's fair. I said, I know. And I walked out into the Phoenix afternoon, got in the car I'd called, and went back to the life I built without his permission. In a city he'd never visited, with a cat he'd never met, writing stories that were entirely and completely mine. To anyone who has ever been introduced as someone's qualifier instead of someone's person, his first wife's daughter, my wife's kid, my stepchild, the one from before, I want you to hear this. You don't need their revision. You don't need them to reintroduce you to the people who already heard the first version. You just need to know the truth yourself, and tell it clearly, and let it do what truth does when you finally stop protecting the people who never protected you. So, I'll ask you this. If the person who spent years editing you out of their story showed up needing you to be in it again, what would you do? Would you open the door all the way? Or would you do what I did? Step into the frame on your own terms, for exactly as long as you chose. Comment below. I read everything. And a final thought on my father, because I think he deserves to be understood rather than simply condemned. He wasn't cruel the way cruelty is usually performed. He didn't yell. He didn't tell me I was worthless. He used subtraction. He removed me from sentences and photographs and introductions in ways that were each individually deniable. That kind of harm is harder to name, which is exactly why it runs so long uninterrupted. The positive lesson, the one I carry now, is this. You can love someone and still damage them profoundly by prioritizing your own comfort over their dignity. Intent doesn't insulate impact, and the children watching the choices you make are always paying attention. Thank you for being here tonight.